Thank you, Jolene, for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be joined by Sharon this evening to talk about her work. And as Jolene mentioned, we'll be referring to some of the works that are now on view at HackelBury, the gallery here in London, where Sharon has a show which can be visited until the 6th of July. But we'll also be referring to some wider aspects of her practice. But without further ado, I think we can kick this off as soon as Sharon is ready to join me.
Right. Hi.
Here she is.
Hi, Flavia. I was trying to join you, but I wasn't allowed until you finished, apparently.
It's done very organized.
Very
Well,
organized.
lovely to have you here.
Thank you. It's
And
great to hear.
lovely to have one of your works in the background. But we'll come back to that in a second. I think for those who might not be that familiar with your practice or perhaps new to it, they might be curious about how you came to photography, which is going to be really the focus of our conversation, but we'll come back to also the many other facets of your work in a second.
So I was basically I came to photography through using camera phones initially. So I was working with a lot of different community groups. I was working, I guess, in what we would now call socially engaged practice. So working with groups of young people, for example, who were working in going to local parks. I was hosting events, helping to, project manage those events and getting involved myself with them. And I'd be documenting what was happening. And it was my way of kind of not only keeping a diary, but when you have funded projects, it's really important to keep documentation of everything that's going on. So I think that's when I started taking it quite seriously. So more or less in my 20s more than earlier on. Prior to that, I was really interested in painting and drawing as my main practice. But it was only later when I was at Central St Martin's that I actually started to take photography a lot more seriously in terms of my own practice, documenting images of myself, particularly during a period of really intense pain where I had spinal surgery. And I found that photography was my way of separating myself from the pain. It was my way of communicating that pain without having the words or sometimes being so heavily medicated that I wasn't able to create. So even raising my hands at that time was really, really difficult. But holding a phone and turning the camera around on myself became my way of working alongside creating audio diaries. So that's when I first really started thinking about photography really in my own practice.
I find very interesting what you're saying. You've used the word documentation a few times in explaining us how you came to photography, both in terms of having a record of an event, of something that you need, let's say almost for bureaucratic purposes when you're working with
Yeah,
communities. You need to prove you've done the work,
yeah,
but also this filter. And I think that experience of the filter of the camera is something that we can all relate to, whether we're like professional photographers or very amateurish. But also there's something in this idea of documentation, there's something very personal, and that might be maybe a starting point for us to look at some of your more recent work where you've also delved into the self. And now I'm going to quickly share my screen. Give me 1 second. Um, here we go. Can you see it?
yes, I can.
Yes, success.
Yes.
And we have here on screen one of the works that's currently in in your show at HackelBury.
Mhm.
And this is a work that you were saying to me is quite meaningful for you because it really brings out a lot of the themes that you're addressing. So I wonder if you might want to say a few words about it.
So this is one of my most recent works. As you can see, it's called Serenity, and it was created just this year. So very, very recent work. It's a collaborative work that I did with my daughter, who's now 11. I was performing the kind of idea of rest. I was really preparing for a show that was happening in Lagos, and this was one of the works that I was playing with in terms of looking at the Black body, the Black female body at rest. I was struck by the idea of traditional imagery around the reclining woman, thinking of sculptural works, thinking of what it actually means to be at rest, and this kind of play between performance of rest and actual rest. But I think in terms of what I did here, I really wanted to direct my daughter into taking this photograph of capturing this moment in time. Another way of, I guess I go back to that idea of documenting this particular moment, but also the idea that this is actually in my, as you can see, it's in my living room. Well, you'd assume it was in my living room unless I went to someone else's, but it's in my living room. And just thinking about this, the space of the home, the domestic space, being a mother, being a working mother, being a woman artist as well, an artist woman.
So much in one image. But again, as you say, we're coming back to this idea of documentation, but also you've already sort of addressed a few of the questions that I'm going to ask you to discuss in more detail as we go along. But something that really struck me when I saw this work, as well as others, is the way you use the cutout as a technique. And perhaps we can make this clear for those who are following us online. Well, maybe you're best placed to explain how you're using the cutouts and what does it mean? What does it do for you?
Okay, so I use the cutout. So if you look at this piece, Serenity, you'll see that there are lots of shapes that have been removed. So I extract certain parts of an image. Sometimes in other images, you'll see that extracted space, that negative space is then replaced. But here I wanted to keep it just as it was. Initially, what I'm thinking about when I'm making these initial cuts, I'm thinking about the work, my practice previously, where I would paint more, I would draw. So for me, the scalpel knife is like a drawing tool. So while I'm making these works, I'm thinking of light and shade. I'm thinking about light and shade initially, and then I will develop the lines from there. Now, for me, it's really important that the lines are very precise. I get quite obsessed with the precision of the lines. I spent all afternoon working on some really, really intricately cut, a really intricately cut piece this afternoon, which I found really relaxing. And I think it goes back to actually that idea of rest. So while I'm making, I feel at rest. I feel like everything can slow down. I'm on my own in my studio space quite often these days. And it's my time to breathe. It's my time to exhale. But here I'm thinking about the extracted space, but also about the shadows, especially in this piece. I was actually working and thinking about shadows while I was making the work.
To make the idea of shadows clearer, maybe this one you can see it very well, how this effect of your cutout creates a shadow onto the back of the image. And it's very interesting the way you're describing it as, it has a very material feel when you see it. It's sculptural, and it defeats the idea of photography being so flat. We associate photography to something very bidimensional, whereas this becomes very three-dimensional. Almost the figures are in the round. And I think you can really see it with this work where you are the subject and you're almost like projecting out through that contrast between the shadows created by the extraction and inside the elements you've decided to retain. I wonder, just, quick curiosity, do you ever have pentimenti? Do you ever sort of go back and feel like, oh, I cut out the wrong thing and now I need to rethink it or start all over again? Or do you sort of like sit down and in this moment of relaxation, you're like, okay, I know exactly what I'm doing?
Well, that's such an interesting question because you don't know this, but I only ever have one image printed. I only give myself one chance. So for me, it's about trusting the process. It's about staying with the work. And I'm using it kind of, I guess, not meaning to sound cheesy at all, but like a almost like a metaphor for life, like whatever's going to be will be. Like you only have so much control and you have to let go. And for me, as you can see, the way I cut is very, very intricate, and there's a lot of control and a lot of thought that goes into it. But when I'm making, I have to let go a little bit. I have to trust the process. Even if I look back and think, oh, I wish I hadn't, it's like, just, it's fine. It's fine. I'm not saying I don't get frustrated and I'm like, oh, I'm so zen. That's not it at all. There are frustrations, but I just try and move with it. Just trust it a little bit, just move with it.
I
And for
mean,
me, yeah.
I think it's beautiful, the sense of like, in a way, letting chance guide you to a certain extent and, releasing some of the control. But also it reminds me the way you're saying you only ever print out one image.
Mm.
I was speaking to someone recently who was saying to me that another artist, they only ever work within limitations, and they find limitations a very sort of constructive state of being. And admittedly, when I think about when I write, when I'm given like a set number of words, I also find that weirdly comforting, but also frustrating
Comforting,
at the
isn't it?
same time. So I understand this sense of like you have to create almost like an external force is there and gives you like the limitation that you need in order to produce.
Yeah, definitely. And I do have, and I think as the work progresses, I have more little rules. So so it started off, only give yourself one chance, one printer. So now it's progressed. I think with this one, I think there was quite an interesting rule. I don't think I'd introduced this rule before, but it was about keeping one continuous line. So almost not allowing the knife to be removed from the paper. I had to keep going to make sure every line was completely fluid. So I'm striving for this kind of fluidity, but it's not fluidity. It's ironic that I'm calling it fluid. But do you see what I mean? Like when you
Yeah.
look really, really closely, they're so, like for me, I didn't want the lines to cross, for example. There were rules around the lines can't cross, the lines must be exactly right. And to get that kind of effect, I then have to remove the varifocals. It gets very intimate. I close the studio door because I don't want anyone to see how intense it gets in here. But I love it. I love the satisfaction that creating this work gives me. But also I love as much as I love the satisfaction of creating the work, I love the response of the work by people who see it.
Mhm.
When HackelBury took me and my work to APAD at the Armory on Park Avenue in New York, it was so interesting spending day after day speaking to people about the work, and also the element of surprise when people saw, or when I told them that the work wasn't laser cut. It was so interesting. Everyone was like, no, but this piece here, that's definitely laser cut. I'm like, no, I did it.
Proving them that, the human mind and the human hand can be even more successful than automatic means.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are imperfections in the work, but for me, if if the naked human eye can't see those, that it is a human hand, that makes me quite excited. It's like, so with all this, with creating this work over the last few years and this continuous kind of elevation of the or escalation of the work, where it began on an A4 cutting mat, the works began on A4 cutting mats while I would sit in front of the TV in the evening after working part-time at a museum. The children had often gone to bed. From going from that to then, eventually making more and more works and increasing the scale, and then the commissions were coming. It's just become really exciting for me, really exciting.
And in this show, you can see you go from like very, very sort of intimate scale all the way to much larger scale. But you know what you're saying also in terms of the development of your own practice resonates with the conditions under which so many women historically, but also now, have been working, as in, you know, caring for a family, often holding another job, and then literally cutting out pieces, pockets of time to work on their own practice as artists, and the skill of the work being dictated by the conditions, by the spaces they had. So I think it's a really interesting progression, the way you just described it, but also coming back to that idea that you shared with us a few minutes ago of like this intimacy that comes through these works that are especially where you're turning the camera on you. And I wonder, as an individual, how do you feel? Because there's quite a few works in the show where you are the subject. Now, how does it feel? What is that? Oh, yeah, what does it feel like?
You can tell by my face. It doesn't feel, it's not the most comfortable part of my practice, the self-portraits. The self-portraits I find more challenging than any other works. This piece, Fractured Introspection, that we have here on the screen, this piece was made more comfortable by the fact that a friend took this photograph. I directed her to take this photograph. It was taken in my studio. And I felt comfortable with the profile, but the scale of it, even when I had it printed, I was like, oh, it almost feels like it's too self-indulgent to include myself in the work. And the irony that the body of work is called Seeing Ourselves, yet to see myself still causes such discomfort, I think is interesting. And that's what I would like to explore even more, especially after seeing the phenomenal show by Zanelli Maholi, where there's an entire room dedicated at the Tate to this amazing self-portraiture. It's, you know, part of a much larger show, but that I found so inspiring and so empowering. And I managed to speak to Maholi afterwards, but that encouragement, that inspiration, to see someone turning the camera around on themselves unapologetically has actually led to a couple of portraits this week that I've been working on. And I showed a friend, I haven't shown anyone, but I showed a friend today, and she was like, wow, it's very different. It was more raw, it's much raw, and it's me in control of the camera again. So that feels exciting.
Do you think that having control on the camera to a certain degree frees you up in a way that you're never as free when you have someone else in front of the camera? When, let's say, we were talking about when we spoke a few weeks ago about the work you did for the National Portrait Gallery, which is a commission. So you were, you know, told to photograph someone else who's not you. How does that sort of differ, that relationship with the camera and the subject?
So
How does
that's
it
really
feel
interesting, because
to be?
the commission for the National Portrait Gallery is very different, because that commission was, in fact, the portraits were not taken by me. So because of the period of time that they wanted to document, I was then asked to work with a team. So the Friends of Eric and Jessica Huntley, and the organisation's called For Halma, and the London Metropolitan Archives. I then worked with them where they gained permission from the artists, so that I could create a collage. So a collage in the National Portrait Gallery collection is a very rare thing. And the reason why we had to use other images was because the images, Jessica Huntley has passed away. So we had to use these archival images, which I really loved using. I loved being able to create these works that were that I was pulling together different elements in a very collage-based style, in a very traditional collage-based style, where it's very heavily it's dense. I didn't leave space. I felt like it just worked as it was, as a full image. But your question is about turning the camera around on myself and
onto others. I mean, how is that process different? Do you ever feel like,
yeah, go on.
for instance, your daughter,
Yeah.
like how does it feel to turn the camera on her
Oh,
as
so
opposed to you?
I take fewer pictures of her. She is featured in the series once, but because I never show her publicly, if I'm turning the camera around, say on a person that I'm featuring in the series, that feels so, I feel much more in control. But if someone else is taking the picture of me, I feel less in control. If I take the picture of myself, more in control again. But there's something about allowing someone to take that photograph of me feels like it feels like real commitment and trust. I hadn't really thought of that too much. It feels like I'm really trusting them. And I feel like I'm in a real state of vulnerability. And I do love the idea of vulnerability, because obviously in order to create the works, you have to be vulnerable to show that, you know, when I walked into HackelBury and all of the works were uncovered, and I saw them for the first time, I felt so, yeah, I just felt very vulnerable. I was like, you know, these are like my babies, I guess, that I'm allowing people to see, to see without my presence, to make their own views, to have their own opinions about the work. So yeah, it feels like a very tricky thing, but I do want to explore self-portraiture more in the work. This is the first time I've ever shown so many self-portraits ever.
And on that note, I wanted to, well, this is an image of the work in situ, and you get a sense of scale in comparison to the works in the background, which are much smaller. But speaking of self-portraits, I wanted to come back to another one and then move on to a few of the other subjects that you explore in the show. This, again, very beautiful image of yourself, this time titled Versailles. So there's almost like a clue planted in the title.
Yeah.
And it's striking, even before you read the title, there's something about the mood and the feeling of this image that's very distinct from everything else that's in the show. It feels from another era, another time, another place. Also, you know, it's such a traditional trope in art history to have women besides windows, longing for the outside world that they very often they weren't allowed to really navigate on their own. But there's a story also to this work that I wonder if you might want to share with our audience today.
So a dear artist friend of mine had a major show in Paris last year and invited me along to see the show, an American-based artist called Deborah Roberts. And I went along to, as you do, went along to Paris. It was the first time ever spending my birthday away from my husband and two children. In probably, I hadn't really had a birthday alone for over 20 years. And this exhibition opening happened to take place night before my birthday, so I couldn't be home. Everyone was happy for me. But we were invited to go to Versailles and have a private tour of Versailles. So it was a bank holiday. The entire palace was completely closed. And we were taken around by the director, just a small group of artists and curators, and basically all friends of the artists that we all know. I looked across to this particular window and I just could see a collage. I could visual, and it was almost like and I turned around to a friend of now mutual friend, and I said, "Can you, Krista David?" I said, who's another collage artist but American, and I asked her, "Can you take this photograph of me? I really want to use this photograph for a piece of work." And I was so excited. She took the photograph, you know, and there were a few goes at taking this photo. But what I could see immediately was I could see this very important moment in time. I really wanted to capture this moment in time where I could potentially create something that felt very, very different from images that you traditionally see in historically in photography. or painting or any art medium, I wanted to create something where the Black figure was, and the Black female figure in particular, was the focal point. And that's what I do throughout all of the pieces. The Black body is the feature, is the focal point, is celebrated through the work. And so this is how this work was created. It feels really special. I just so happen to be wearing a dress that looks like I'm
It was meant to be.
it was meant to be.
I mean,
And
again, chance.
yeah. And I love those kind of moments. Do you know what I love about photography? I love those chance moments to just document something and to capture something and to hold it. But also all of the memories that it triggers. My memory is very, very bad. And so to have, and I'm sure it's the same for so many people, to have a phone where you can take a photograph, or to have a camera that you can use and document, and to capture these moments feels really special. But it particularly speaks to the work that I've done with the National Maritime Museum, where I've, my practice isn't just the collage and the paper cutout works that are photography based, that it also expands beyond that. I wanted to make works that explore history, explores imagery of Blackness in museum collections and archives. And so I've been working with them for the last 4 years to on another series called Seeing Ourselves, but seeing ourselves through the archives, through the collections. And I've been hosting a podcast series and a number of different talks and events.
I mean, this preempts one of the other questions I had for you, which is, we're very much looking at the works that are more of a photography-based kind, even though you're really expanding the notion of photography. I would say for you, it's a very, it's almost like sculptural, painterly,
Yeah.
it's like drawing. It combines lots of different media. But you're also at the same time and in parallel very much working across many different platforms. As you just said, you've been doing work for quite a few years with the National Maritime Museum. You've done you've been very involved in community projects. I wonder, how do all of these ideas, feelings, moods, I mean, perhaps, one might say sort of reclaiming agency of the Black body might be one common theme across all of these disciplines and practices. But what does it do for you as a sort of individual? Like, how do you bring together these different ideas and platforms?
I think they just seem to work together. I see them all part of the same body of work. I feel as though the 2D, or sometimes they look more 3D, these floating collage and paper cutout works, they sit in one space, but they also sit alongside works where I'm able to have discussions around what the Black body looks like, what role it played, who had agency over those bodies, who was taking photographs of our bodies, who was where we were placed in historically within the images, but also where we're placed in society. I think there is a very, very close link to that. But what I feel that this whole body of work is doing is encouraging me to make change. So, for example, with the National Maritime Museum, yes, we have open discussions. I have very open discussions with curators and artists and historians, but I also have I've also rewritten some of those object descriptions, because I felt really strongly, as did many other people that I'd invited in, that those descriptions weren't really, they didn't celebrate the Black body, they didn't respect the Black body. So it was really important to reframe that. So my work is a reframing. I feel like historically we've been placed in one space predominantly in the mainstream, but it's, for me, I'm really keen to turn that around and to work towards a different narrative. And that's really, really important for me. So I need to work on all these different streams to get to the same goal. get to that same goal, really.
It must be also very enriching to be operating on so many different levels.
Yeah.
And I think, that's why I know you borrowed as a title for your show, Seeing Ourselves. It's a title you borrowed from Frances Borzello's book on self-portraiture. But to me, it feels as more, Frances Borzello is focusing on self-portraiture. I feel you're using it in a much more expansive way. It's about seeing yourself as in Sharon, but also seeing the Black body, seeing the world. How do we see? How do we take ownership? How do you reclaim agency? And when we were speaking, I asked you whether you felt your work was activist or could be conceived to a certain extent as having a degree of activism. And I wonder if you might want to share your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I do see it. I think there's a common conception, a common idea that activism means, you're in the street, that you're speaking the loudest, that you kind of fit into some kind of ideal of what an activist is. I feel as though I'm an activist in the work I'm doing. And so my activism may not be as loud as other people's or appear as loud, but I think the effects and the changes that and the impact that I'm having to organise it to institutions such as the National Maritime Museum is significant. And that's not just me, that's not my ego, that's what they've said to me. And so I do feel as though the work is activist work. I feel as though, especially with having inspirations such as Eric and Jessica Huntley, who, yes, they're political and social activists, the two people that I have featured in the National Portrait Gallery piece, but they also set up a supplementary school for young Black children. I was one of the children that was fortunate enough to go to that supplementary school. Let's just keep it real there. I wasn't, at the time when I was really, really young, I wasn't necessarily going, I'm really fortunate to go to that Saturday school. I did not want to go to school on a Saturday. But what that taught me from an early age is to see myself, to see Black educators, to be taught about Black authors, Black poets, people who have done amazing things historically who are Black. So I grew up with that, and I'm proud to be part of their legacy. So from early on, I've seen activists just doing their thing, like carving out a different way of being, a different way of celebrating themselves and ourselves. So yeah, I do see myself as an activist, but maybe a softly spoken one. Sometimes it depends who's talking to me.
Well, that's important. But also, it's not the loudest that always really enables change to happen. It's what you were saying, as a child, probably the idea of going to school on a Saturday wasn't the most appealing of things, but in hindsight, it really shaped your understanding of a place and a space and a voice.
Yeah, it did. Really did.
And that kind of soft presence, it's what really then shapes and changes society. So I think that's an incredibly powerful instrument and tool. So
And I think there is space for both. I
yeah,
feel as though there's space for the quieter activists, but there is also space for the louder ones. I think it's about working together, but towards the same cause, and not feeling like there's only one way to instigate change. So I feel as though everyone has that place.
yes, everyone should own their own voice and
Yeah.
their sort of platform and way of conveying it.
Yeah.
I know we have just a few more minutes before we open up to questions, and I just wanted to show a few more images from your current show, and especially this one, Longing for Lagos, which to me, when I walked into the space and most of the works were they were very much about seeing yourself. This one felt like a different pace, a different rhythm, something else was going on. And I wondered if you could comment on how it came about and what does it mean to you to have this work in the show?
So this means a lot it really means a lot to have this work. Immediately when the when the image came up, I smiled. I was fortunate enough to go on a residency last November to Lagos. This work is a compilation of photographs, is a collage of photographs from that trip. So when I initially went on the residency, I had all these ideas, oh, I'm going to go out into the marketplace and I could visualize this market scene and loads of people, and I soon realized that idea of how I was going to take these photographs or how I was going to make work was, I had to be flexible. It wasn't going to work. So a lot of these photographs were, especially right up until you get to the building on the right-hand side with a woman just about to walk up the stairs with the bottles of water, until you get to that image, most of those images were taken through glass. They were taken whilst in the back of a car, and whilst driving around through the city. I was really drawn to the women who are so often maybe not noticed as much, the women who are making things happen, the women who are carrying, the women who are working. And in contrast to Serenity, the first image we showed where my body is at rest, although I'm still working, to that image, there's the Black body at rest. However, in Longing for Lagos, we can see even the child on the woman's back, even though she's sleeping, she's holding something. And it was making me think, this work really makes me think about how from such an early age, we're taught to work, we're taught, keep going, keep working, keep things moving. I just really wanted to capture what Lagos meant to me, what Lagos means to me, one of the elements of what it means to me. But it's also an interesting piece, and it makes me smile because it was shortly before I arrived in Lagos that I actually had my ancestry DNA results come back, and they said that it said that I was 25% Nigerian, and so I had this. I think there's this longing in my work for belonging, longing for space. Ironically, the body of work, the project that I've been working on with the National Maritime Museum is Seeing Ourselves, but the overarching project is around belonging. And so it's coming back to these things all the time. These kind of threads are all being intertwined. And here on the far right-hand side, a friend asked me today if that was rope, and those were actually my braids, which I had installed in Lagos. It was just such a I feel like there's so much more work to be done on this piece, but also the two pieces that sit alongside it in the hall as you walk through, which are connected to it. So this is Longing and Belonging 2, and then there's another one, Longing and Belonging 1. I'm not sure if it's fine. Yeah, it's fine. I don't think you have that one, but yeah. So this is a photograph taken in Barbados last October. So I went to October before Lagos. Very lucky. And
Good fall you had.
what's that?
Good autumn you had.
Good autumn. It was actually Barbados, New York, and then Lagos back to back. So I had this cold snap in the middle, but also, yeah, it was a very enriching, very full trip. But the interior of that portrait is actually Lagos. So here I'm questioning where I belong, where I'm longing for, where I'm belonging, if I belong, where is home, all things that I'm constantly thinking about. So yeah, I still have so much to explore, I think, throughout my practice. There are threads that I'm trying to pull together, but I'm just enjoying the process, and I'm enjoying the fact that I have still such a long way to go.
Do you think this is a thread that you want to pull out, distill more in your future work?
Yeah, there's so much more. I mean, there are some works that I started while I was getting ready for the show, but they just felt like they weren't resolved yet. And those are images of I was looking at ancestry, so I was looking at images of my grandmother, who means a lot to me, who passed away over 20 years ago. but I still sit, like I just glanced across, I still sit with a photograph of her at my desk. So just thinking about who she was, what her story was, how can I celebrate her and her memory and what I carry with me. And that references actually back to shadows. We talked about shadows earlier, and the reason why shadows are so important in my work
I think you
is,
can see it quite well in this work. You can see
yeah, you can see the
how,
shadows really well.
yeah.
So I use shadows as a to reference the past and the present, to reference what you carry from the past, what you bring with you. But sometimes the shadows in my works feel more important. Quite often they feel more important than the actual paper cutout.
Mhm.
So I'm just thinking about history, I'm thinking about our stories, I'm thinking about what we bring with us, but what we leave behind. And I don't see shadows as a negative thing. I see them as a positive. Um, so
Well,
yeah,
as
that's
a
what,
viewer, I mean, I think the way you read those shadows is they add a layer, they add complexity to your characters. That's why I'm sort of reluctant to call them photographs, because I feel it's almost diminutive in terms of like the sort of richness and layering of what you're doing. But you know, that's me imposing my own uh,
no,
perception of the work.
I kind of like it.
Well, you can take it. It's yours.
I'll take it, thanks. I'll take that.
I think we have a few minutes for questions now. So I'm going to stop sharing. Here, we've come back full screen. And I wonder if anyone has questions, feel free to pop them into the Q&A box. And I'll read them out loud and Sharon will respond. I hope I made this sound enticing. Don't be shy.
We'll soon find out.
But while we wait, I'm going to ask you another question that is always something I'm curious. So, you know, when you know you're doing a show
Mm.
and you know you have a space, as in the case of now the HackelBury show, how do you go about it? Like, is there a work that you start with and you say, okay, this is going to be my starting point? Or do you start with a theme? How do you develop a show?
I think with this, it depends on the show. So for Seeing Ourselves, I'm already making the work. The work I've been making this body of work, I think for about 6 years now. But I don't ever see, well, currently I don't see an end to it. I feel as though there's so much more to do, as I said. But I think if it's more of a group show, the gallery or the curator tends to come to me with a theme and say, you know, these are the themes of this show. Do you have something? So, for example, the show that I was part of with Echo Eshen at Claridge's Art Space, there was a theme around the body and nature. So that was kind of easy for me because a number of my works are use nature in it. But I created other works for that show. So it tends to be, especially for the Seeing Ourselves, it was like I already had works in progress anyway. And they just wanted to exhibit the work, exhibit the work that I was interested in showing.
I see that since, you know, we called out for questions, we got a few in. So I'm going to start with Serena, who's congratulating you on the show. She hopes to visit soon. What would be a dream commission, or is there a place where you would love to see your work?
Oh, I like that question.
Yeah, nice.
Oh my gosh, I've just thought of it. I didn't actually think this was a thing. I've never really. Okay, so the Turbine Hall at the Tate with large sculptural hanging collage works that you can walk through as you walk through like towards the end more maybe. But anyway, the Turbine Hall, having that space to create something super large scale, really feeds into the idea of taking up space, because that's a really important part of what I do, and how I now live my life trying to take up space, especially as a woman and as a Black woman. I want to take up more and more space.
Very good. You should. Another question. Lilo Lilo, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing anyone's name. Please cut me some slack. Um, who's asking, when you were starting out, what was your biggest challenge when you were selling works? Was it hard? How did you sustain yourself financially? And how did you sort of, I guess, balance it out with your...
You're an excellent paper system.
Oh, it's
Yeah, Lila. Yeah, so basically it was really hard. It still can be hard. So I was working part-time for a museum. That's how I, subsidized my income so that I wasn't relying just on one revenue stream. I still try and take that approach now. So, working with the museum, I have, with the National Maritime Museum, I have some money coming in then sometimes, or if I'm doing my mentoring, I mentor on a BBC One program called Make It at Market. So I mentor on that. So I can then, it subsidizes my income there, but I also get to speak to people about my about how I've done things. So I'm not encouraging people necessarily to just go, okay, that's it. I just want to throw everything in the air and I just want to give up. I personally didn't do that. I waited quite a long time. And I've only been full-time working as an artist for 4 years, which is not very long at all. But that's just because I wasn't ready. I was a bit scared.
Also, it sounds like a very sensible approach. It's a juggling act, and that I think only speaks highly about, the commitment you have towards your work.
Yeah.
I think that's a very sensible approach. Sasha is asking, is painting going to become a bigger part of your work, or do you want to predominantly work with photography?
It's not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily going to take over. So as in the painting, I don't think will necessarily take over. Although saying that, I have prepped 3 small canvases that are ready to go. If I didn't have to go home this evening, I'd be working on those. I'm just looking at them thinking, I want to work on them. But I really love photography. I love the feeling that I get from collaging and creating paper cutouts. I think I'll intertwine the two more, but I just really enjoy collaging. I feel like that I've got so much more to explore, especially with trying to make them even more sculptural looking I can't see I can't see painting necessarily overtaking photography and currently.
I feel like from, the little you've sort of let me into your practice and the few conversations we've had, it seems like it's a very porous relationship that you have between media. But I don't want to take more space from questions. There's more coming. VS, there's not a name here, but can you tell us about your technique and how it has evolved? As many Black artists have to go so deep into their feelings, and that does leave space for just talking about the speciality of your own unique technique.
So tell more about the technique and how it's evolved. So it started out with well, before the collages, I was actually painting. So that's where, these almost like shards of color, these shapes of color, and building up those colors, I would use that approach to create portraits and sometimes abstract paintings. And then I had an injury, which meant I couldn't stand and I couldn't paint anymore. So I then went, okay, what have I got? I've got some magazines, I've got some an A4 cutting mat, I've got some glue and a scalpel knife, and I started making the works then, as I said, from my sofa. It's evolved into directing a film, for example, last year for the Fitzwilliam Museum, for that iconic show, Black Atlantic. I directed my first film that was in an institution, which is fantastic. But what I loved about that was, for me, the lighting was really important. So the lighting being able, I could see when the lighting had changed, and I would say to the crew, I'd be like, the lighting's changed. I can't see those shapes anymore. And for me, when I'm looking at the shapes on people's faces. I'm looking at the light and shade, and that was really important. So I think it's developed from being this kind of 2D practice, pulling together different bits of imagery, to directing a film, to hosting a podcast series, to being in spaces where I traditionally wouldn't have seen myself.
Rebecca is asking, well, she's thanking for the discussion, and the show is fantastic. What lesson would you pass on to another emerging artist?
So the message I pass on is to not give up. That's my main message. Not give up. Just keep making, keep creating, keep exploring, keep trusting yourself. Listen to other people, be inspired by other people, yes, but do what works for you. Try and do something unique. Don't make work like everyone else's. I remember there was a point a few years ago where a few people have said to me, so when is seeing ourselves going to stop? You're going to keep making works about Black women. Imagine if I'd listened to those other people. Imagine if I just kind of go, oh, you're right, actually, maybe I should stop. Maybe, you know, just maybe take up this job full time in the museum. That's what I need to do. But I didn't give up. So I go ahead.
But I think that comes from you having really, in a way, like it's such a strength to know how to hold your ground and be able to like sort of shelter to a certain extent your practice from a lot of voices, and probably having really wanted this practice, having grown into it over time, made you a lot more
Resilient.
stronger and
Yeah.
resilient.
But I'm not naturally a really strong, resilient person. That's the thing. And I think more and more with this series and with this body of work, it's made me stronger. It's made me more resilient. It's made me want to make the works even more fragile, to show the lightness that we are so often as Black women aren't given the space to be. So in doing so, it would be a travesty if I didn't live by those kind of rules and those ideas. So I think it's but I think it's about taking inspiration and talking to people as well.
Mm.
You know, people who feel warm to you, people who feel like light, head towards that kind of light, I think, in terms of the people.
One last question from Jolene. So we're going to wrap up.
Yeah.
We're coming full circle. Jolene introduced us, and now we're wrapping up with her
Okay.
question. Um, so she's saying, I understand that activism is a really key part of your practice. Has your approach to this changed, evolved over time, and if so, how?
Hmm. I think my ideas about what activism is has definitely changed. I think I'm much stronger. I'm more adamant in what my views are. I'm willing to listen, obviously. I'm not a complete tyrant, but I'm just very, very determined to continue with what I'm doing. And I'm willing to work alongside people to help these changes, you know, to ensure these changes happen. But yeah, I think I embrace the activism that I hold, but I also respect the activism of others. And I didn't feel as though there was space for both. I felt like mine wasn't really worthy, if I'm honest. But now I feel like it's okay. And just like the series, it's okay to be me. And that feels like a good place.
And I think it's such a beautiful place to end on, the importance of being you and having this faith and love for your work, which I think transpires from the way you talk about it, and also from your commitment to your practice. Because there's a lot of dedication and love, and it really, I think, comes through in every single cut you've made by
Yeah.
hand with your scalpel.
Thank you. There was one quote actually that sums that up, and I wasn't sure if it would be relevant, but it feels very relevant now when you say that. So it was from Angela Bassett on Oprah's Super Soul podcast.
Mm.
And Angela Bassett said, I want the world to see us in our beauty and complexity and have compassion for us. And I think that's a beautiful way to end it. And that's what I really strive for.
Oh, that really is a beautiful way to end, and such a also beautiful way of like thinking about your practice. Well, thank you so much, Sharon, for sharing your ideas, your passions, your thoughts with us, being so generous and very open. And thank you all for joining and listening to us this evening. And please do go and see Sharon's show. It's on until the 6th of July.
Yes, at HackelBury Fine Art. Wonderful. Thank you, Flavia. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Of course, me too. And thank you to the festival.
Yeah, definitely.
And to HackelBury for co-organizing the talk.
Brilliant.
Thank you.